Hello and welcome to this MIMHtraining.com presentation on suicide prevention, an attempt survivor's perspective. My name is Tom Pansella with the Missouri Institute of Mental Health. Thanks for taking the time to take this training program. We're joined today by Dr. DeQuincy Lezine. And Dr. Lezine attempted suicide himself 3 times, beginning in 1995 in his first year of college. After the fall semester, he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. In the following year, he formed the first student-led college mental health and suicide prevention group, the Brown University chapter of the Suicide Prevention Action Network. And working with SPAN USA, he was an early advocate for including individuals who were living with mental disorders or who had attempted suicide in the development of a suicide prevention program and in development of policy issues. He completed his doctoral training in clinical psychology at UCLA and then completed a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Rochester Center for the Study and Prevention of Suicide with training specific to the suicide prevention research. In 2008, he completed a book published by Oxford University Press, combining his autobiographical experience with research and practical advice for youth struggling with suicidal thoughts. The title of that book is 8 Stories Up, An Adolescent Chooses Hope Over Suicide. And Dr. Lezine, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
So I think we got a little bit of a perspective on this, but how did you find yourself ending up working in the field of suicide prevention?
Well, really, after having attempted suicide, I ended up looking up a lot of information about suicide and came across the website for the Suicide Prevention Action Network. And then started talking with them, corresponding with them, and then getting involved kind of from there.
And why is this then an important topic for you to be talking about and for us to be talking about?
I think it's because too many people are dying by suicide. And that continues to be the case until we are able to come up with some kind of prevention programs that work and that can be sustained and that will be broad enough to reach a number of people so that that rate will decline.
And what kind of work are you doing right now?
Right now I'm working at a nonprofit doing evaluation services for groups that are doing prevention work. And then I also do public speaking and some writing and then some consulting.
Tell us a little bit about the book.
Okay. The book was 8 Stories Up, published by Oxford University Press, and I was approached to tackle the topic of youth suicide and youth suicide prevention, and kind of combine my perspective, being somebody who had attempted suicide, with information from science to the rest of the knowledge base about suicide prevention in terms of what people could do to get help, what type of treatment there was available, what type of therapy, what type of medication, and try to wrap that all up into a book that kind of serves as a guide or a light so that people can figure out how to get themselves some help.
And so in your work now, and in the book research and personal experiences, what are you seeing is kind of the prevalence of mental illness and depression and the suicidal ideation on the college campuses?
I think that some authorities would agree that the prevalence is probably going up some. And that's kind of a combination of several things. One is that people now have more access to treatment, more access to medications that are pretty helpful, and so they're able to get to college. There's also more stress now, more competition in terms of getting in and in terms of completing college. There's more stress in terms of trying to find a job afterwards, particularly in this economy, wondering, okay, now I have my degree, am I going to need to get a higher degree, or am I going to need to do something else in order to get a job and move forward after college? There's various things that are kind of coming into play. I think that also as we get more gatekeeper programs, more awareness programs, more things happening on the college campuses, people are more willing to reach out for help. And because of that, it might look like there's more people, even though the number of people might be about the same or maybe a little bit higher. It's going to look like there's more because more people are seeking help.
Do you think that the society at large would treat youth with mental illness differently than they would treat adults with mental illness?
I think so, definitely. I think that in general our society is more protective of youth and thus more willing to try to get them to help, more feeling like it's probably not as much their fault. more wanting to protect them, help them get to a place where they can improve. And then for adults, it's more kind of fend for yourself a lot of times. And I think we're starting to change that. It's starting to switch in the direction of encouraging people to get help, but it has been moving pretty slowly.
Are you comfortable talking about your story?
Yeah, sure.
How did you get yourself into help?
I was dragged into help by my friend. I had a very good friend in college who went and started talking to the therapist and saying, look, my friend is really suicidal. I think he needs help. He's really reluctant to come. She eventually went with me to a session, and then I started talking to a therapist and found a really good therapist, and that helped me to be able to feel like, okay, these are people who actually care about what's happening to me. They're not just people who are sitting there going, okay, I'm getting a paycheck, and okay, your hour's up, which is kind of the way that I felt before that.
So do you work with engaging other people to try and connect them with resources then too?
Mm-hmm. A lot of times I am now working with folks trying to get them connected to resources, but also working with groups that are organizations or providers of services, trying to get them to kind of broaden their approach to be able to reach more people and not just working on a one-to-one basis, but besides that, also doing things that could reach a broader population and try to bring more people help and try to push the entire population to a point where they feel more comfortable seeking help so that people get help earlier.
And how do you think you can make that happen? How do you think you can get that outreach broadened to achieve some of those goals?
Some of it is things like just shifting policies on college campuses or shifting policies in communities. And what I mean by policies is things like how easy it is to be able to access help. Where help is available, when help is available. Because a lot of times people might feel lonely and depressed and suicidal at night, and things are closed. And so there might be the lifeline, the telephone number to be able to call, but in terms of actually getting help on campus or in your community, there might not be a whole lot available. So it's having that extra availability, having people be accessible, and then having the word spread through media or through other types of public information campaigns that raise people's awareness about, okay, there is help available. I don't have to feel this way the entire time. I can get better without having to resort to killing myself.
Do you access some of the newer media, the social networking, the other internet-based sites or the chat services or anything like that?
Definitely. I spend a lot of time generally on Twitter, and that's because it's just brief. It's easy to be able to reach out to a lot of people. And I think besides that, I just work a lot with organizations now, and then working with Lifeline. And we do some stuff back and forth on Twitter as well, and kind of going from there into the new media. But I think I've stuck primarily with that site.
Is there a stigma related to mental illness still on the college campuses?
Definitely. I think that whenever we have some big event that happens, some major publicized suicide, oftentimes the way that people get labeled or the way that people look at them kind of just reinforces the stereotype that somebody with mental illness is just going to go off and either they're going to kill themselves or try to kill other people. And it doesn't really show the extent of the number of people who are students on campus who are dealing with a mental illness and trying to get it under control, and going to treatment, pursuing new options, and then just going through life as a student on campus, and then also struggling with this mental illness. A lot of times the focus is always on, okay, there's this person and they've totally lost control and now they're off their medications and look at what happens.
What kind of changes did you see in yourself from your point of getting a diagnosis?
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, at first I got the diagnosis wrong. So they had diagnosed me just with straight depression. Initially, I think some thought that it was just going to kind of be a single episode, and that would be it. I was just a little depressed. And then eventually they realized, well, maybe this is something that's kind of recurrent. Maybe they're going to be up and down, more depressed. And then eventually it came to light that I had had some times where I was more up, more manic, struggling with more agitation, pacing more active at night. And then we started looking into that and came to the diagnosis of bipolar disorder, which was kind of a relief in some ways because it explained more of what I experienced as opposed to just saying, oh, it's depression. And in some ways was kind of downing because it felt like this is something that now I have to carry with me as a label, something else that people are going to look at and say, oh, well, he's bipolar, so now we have to be afraid of him, or now we have to kind of avoid him or something. So it's kind of a double-edged sword in some ways, but it does help in terms of finding medication or finding therapy that will be more specific to the types of things I was struggling with.
Well, I think you touched on something there too. When you're talking with folks, do you encourage them to stick with the diagnostic process? Mm-hmm. Because you talked about it, you kind of hit on it being an imperfect process.
Right.
Do you work with them on that as well?
Yeah, I think when I was doing my clinical work, some of the way that we were thinking was kind of moving in more of a direction of focus on what people are experiencing and try to treat that. So a lot of the medication regimens, I think, have kind of been moving to the point of, okay, this person is experiencing psychosis, or this person is experiencing hallucinations, or this person has racing thoughts. Let's try to get that worked on, no matter if that happens to be because of a depression with psychosis, or because of bipolar disorder with psychosis, or schizoaffective disorder, or schizophrenia. A lot of times you're now going to be finding some of the same medication classes going across all of those. And then the same thing with therapy. A lot of times now people will be doing something like a cognitive behavioral style of therapy. And then somebody comes in and you figure out what their problems are, you figure out how they're thinking about it, and what they're going to be able to do to try to alleviate some of that burden. And a lot of times now it's not going to be as specific to a diagnosis, although a diagnosis does help you kind of move in the right direction.
I'm hearing, too, from different folks that there are different approaches to what needs to be treated if somebody is suicidal. Mm-hmm. What's your perspective on what should be treated?
My perspective is that the first thing is the person's pain, and not as much the symptoms that may be associated with a particular disorder. It's the emotional pain that somebody is feeling and the hopelessness. So it's the feeling that everything in my life is negative, everything is terrible, the world is crumbling around me, people don't care, and this is not going to change. And the things that add to that feeling of pain and distress could be something ranging from like a boyfriend or girlfriend leaves, you lose a parent, and then things that might be more internal, like now I'm starting to experience hallucinations and delusions, and I feel like my mind is not what it used to be. I might have to drop out of school, so that's distressing to me. But I think that eventually it comes down to that feeling that life is no longer bearable, and I don't think that that's going to change, and therefore I am suicidal. So I think that that is what we need to focus on in terms of the first things. And then after that, you could focus on some of the other things that kind of led to that.
There does also seem to be some discussion around whether it is reasonable or appropriate to remove somebody from a college campus that has attempted a suicide. Mm-hmm. If not permanently, then until they're no longer considered a harm to themselves, a threat to themselves. What's your perspective on that?
I could certainly see the perspective of wanting to remove somebody from a particular situation that might be harmful. And that's often one of the rationales for having somebody go and spend some time in an inpatient facility in a hospital. And that would be the same if you had some kind of physical ailment that was really debilitating, and so you need to spend some time in an environment that's away from that, some time where professionals will be able to work with you on a more intensive basis. But in terms of removing somebody from campus, I think that for a lot of folks, particularly when you're young, the college campus is a place that's now part of your identity. It's part of who you are. It's your peer group. It's kind of the definition of who you are now and where you're going. So to take that away from somebody, I don't think, personally from my opinion, is a good idea. When they threatened, I use the term threatened, to move me off of campus and to force me to take leave, I found that to be something that was like, okay, you're penalizing me for number one, feeling suicidal, so feeling so crummy about myself that I want to die, and now I'm being penalized for that. And number two, talking to somebody about it, because otherwise you guys wouldn't have known that I was suicidal. So I feel crummy, I want to die, you're penalizing me for that, and because I decided to seek help, now you know that I want to die, and so you want to penalize me for that. And that did not feel like something to me that would be particularly therapeutic.
Were you ever put in an inpatient setting, or did you ever go to an inpatient setting on your own?
Yes. They encouraged me to go to an inpatient facility for a little while when I was suicidal back in college.
You talked about your friend.
Mm-hmm.
What's your message for the friends out there? What do you tell people who may know somebody, who may suspect something in somebody?
Mm-hmm. I think friends can make a major difference to somebody's life. I think that for me, both the friend that I had on campus and then eventually the group of friends that I had mostly back from high school, back in Los Angeles, to the friends that I also had on campus, helped me to be willing to go into the hospital and willing to accept more help and willing to try out the medications and to stick with trying the medications, because oftentimes you'll try one regimen and you'll try one medication and it might work for a little while, it doesn't work initially, or you have to wait a couple weeks for it to work. So you really have to stick with it, and it helps to have that type of support to be able to stick with it. So friends make a big difference.
And would you think in hindsight that there's anything that anybody could have done to prevent you from making the attempts?
In some ways I want to say yes, and in some ways I want to say no. I want to say yes because I think that there were signs for a long time that something was potentially wrong, something was potentially happening. But I also want to say no because unless you know what to look for, unless you realize that this is something that indicates something's wrong, then you can't really take action about it. You might just say, oh, okay, well, that's kind of odd, but maybe that's just the phase they're going through right now. Or maybe we just need to give them some time. So unless people have the awareness and education and knowledge about what to look for, it's hard to ask them to realize that something is wrong and to know what to do about it. But I also want to say yes because there are those opportunities there. And particularly for folks who are in positions such as teachers, professors, instructors, doctors. These are people who have more of an insight or more of a possibility for insight into what's happening with students and with youth or with patients that they see. And one example is having writings or projects that deal with depression or suicide. And you turn those in to the professor, you turn those in to the TA, and they have to read through it, they grade it, so they see everything that's going on with a lot of the students. And sometimes people are just going to, write some kind of story, and sometimes people are going to express, this real deep sense of angst. And if nobody takes a chance to say, oh, well, maybe there's something going on with this person, maybe I should check in with them, that's a missed opportunity.
What were some of the opportunities with you, do you think?
I had a couple of music classes where I specifically wrote about youth suicide and a young person deciding to die by suicide. And then also some writing projects where I had written similar things. And then a lot of my statements, I think, both in email and just in talking to people, became much more dark, much more morose, much more talking about death and feeling like maybe I didn't belong anywhere. So there were some opportunities, I think, but as I said before, it depends on if people are aware enough to be able to pick up on the fact that that's something that should be alarming to people.
Are you familiar with consumer-operated programs?
Yes.
As a general concept? What would be some steps that the consumer-operated programs could take to kind of do some outreach to young adults, either seeking help before or providing support after such an attempt?
Mm-hmm. I think that there's a lot that peer-operated services could do. But I think that one thing that we kind of need to overcome is this barrier that's kind of been in place between people who are healthcare or mental health care professionals and those that are in more of a peer-run or peer-operated or peer-led type of service. And sometimes there's some conflict there, and I think that when that gets resolved, then both groups can kind of work in concert and get more done. And in terms of peer-led groups having influence on people, I think that I was much more willing to talk to and listen to people who had some kind of similar experience to mine. Somebody who could say, okay, I have been there, and I know what you're feeling, and I realize how hopeless it is because I've seen that type of hopelessness. And then to be able to say, okay, and then here's something that helped me, here's treatment that actually does work, here's hope that you might be able to find.
What are some kinds of resources that people can hook up with that are valuable to you? I would say either for people on college campuses that you think you could link people to, or even families.
Part of me wants to say that my book is a new resource. So it's 8 Stories Up by Oxford University Press. And the reason why I really wanted to do that project is because when I was struggling with things, I went to the library. I poured through Amazon.com and Porter's and Barnes & Noble looking for something that would say to me, this is somebody who's had a similar experience. This is somebody who's not just writing based on some theory, based on some studies that they've done. This is somebody who has had that experience and could talk to me at that level. And that didn't really exist. And so I wanted to try to put that out there as something that now would be available for people. And I think that also on college campuses now, a wonderful group is Active Minds on Campus, which started down in the D.C. and Pennsylvania area, and is now on many, many college campuses. Some of the local groups that I did go to for a little while, anyhow, was now called the Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance. Which is mostly for people with mood disorders to be able to talk to each other, and also for family members. I've also done some work with the NAMI, National Alliance for Mental Illness, and they have some good groups, particularly for family members, and then they have some that's also kind of a peer-to-peer type of service. So then there's also National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, and I enjoy working with them because they actually talk to people who have had experiences. They talk to family members, they talk to scientists and researchers and clinicians, and try to pull all of that information together to say, okay, how can we get people to call us to get help, and how can we help the people who are on the lines taking calls to be able to assist people in their current frame of mind to feel like they don't have to act right now, and then to take those people from where they are and get them to a referral to something that might be able to help them out.
And a lot of our audience for these types of training programs are the frontline mental health professionals who may get that first opportunity to see somebody. Mm-hmm. What would be your message to them?
The thing that was most helpful to me from my therapist was hearing them say that they thought that my life was worth living. Hearing them say that they believed that I did have a future that would be worth looking forward to. That even if I couldn't see it, they would hold that in mind and tell me to believe in their viewpoint that there was something positive at the end, something that I could look forward to that I might not be able to see right now, but that they could see. And then the actual strategies, the actual behavioral interventions, the techniques that they've learned, that was helpful. But the most helpful thing was actually feeling that personal connection, feeling somebody else say, I have seen similar cases, I hear what you're saying, I hear your pain, but I think that there's something on the horizon for you.
Thank you, Dr. Lezine.
Thanks.
And Dr. Lezine, of course, mentioned the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. That number is 1-800-273-TALK. It's 1-800-273-8255. Take advantage of that. Take advantage of the resources that are available to you. Thanks for your time today. And again, thanks for your time and your expertise.
Thank you.